Hello, welcome to BookSquirrel, and this is my review for Hello, welcome to BookSquirrel, and this is my book review for Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes. BookSquirrel. I don't know. I thought I would wear my Trogdor shirt because Something Wicked is very much Trogdor burninating the peasants and his consummate V's. But now I kind of wonder if I shouldn't just wear this for, like, when I'm really just upset. Something Wicked This Way Comes is actually the second book in Ray Bradbury's Greentown trilogy. The first book is called Dandelion Wine. I did not read that book. I made sure to research whether or not I needed to read that book before I read this one, and they're standalone enough that you really don't need to do that. I don't feel like I was confused about anything in this book, so I really don't think you need to read Dandelion Wine first if you just want to jump right into Something Wicked This Way Comes. I did read this book digitally, but in print it's 314 pages, and my version was published in April of 2013, although the book was originally published in September of 1962. Now, in order to review this book, I am going to use my ACORN system, where I look at the book's approach, characters, originality, readability, and narration. Each area is a potential 20 acorns for a potential total of 100 acorns. And here is the blurb. When the carnival comes to town, two boys unearth the terrifying and horrible secrets that lurk within Cooger and Dark's pandemonium shadow show, and learn the consequences of wishes, as a sinister and evil force is at work in Greentown, Illinois. And that's it. Let's get this show on the road. Approach, first impressions, the cover, the blurb, the beginning of the book. I'm just making a joke about how everything's a list in this book. So as you can tell from the blurb, it's very short, it's very to the point, and I did like that. I like circus themes, I like dark themes, and I really resonated with this idea. The book is relatively short, so I thought, hey, this sounds pretty good. And I did like the cover. I think that the cover is really cool with the train and the skull in shadow rising from the smokestack, the colors of the blues, the bluish greens. I really liked how this cover looks. And I know some people don't really care about covers, but I find them to be really important for setting a tone and a theme, right? I am a very visual thinker at times, and I like to just have some kind of visual reference. It does help me. And I will say, there is a scene early on where the train comes into town, and it really fits the description. So I really like this cover. I thought this cover was effective. When it came to the first chunk of the story, which is what I include in my approach score, it is not like the precise blurb at all. This is where I wish blurbs were much more indicative of the writing, because if you read the blurb and you go, oh, this sounds interesting, and then you get into the writing and it's just like, what is this? This isn't to knock Ray Bradbury's writing. I think his prose is actually really interesting, and I'll get to that more in the narration. But I did feel like I had to reprogram my brain a little bit, reformat it a little to make sense of the writing as is. It definitely feels like a product of another time. A lot of the words that I read, especially even in the first chunk, it was a lot of old sayings. It was a lot of references that are just no longer around. There were even some words that I clicked on to look at the definition, and it was like archaic. And it's not like this is that old. I mean, this was written in the 1960s, right? But it just goes to show how much of a different time it was, right? I was really liking the eeriness. I thought that from the very jump, the eeriness was there. The interesting character dynamics were there. And so while I was still very interested in the story, I was nervous about what it was going to be like to read this book, even though it's short, because of this like language aspect. So I did knock off some points, but in the end, I was intrigued and I was still looking forward to reading it. So I give the approach for Something Wicked This Way Comes a 15 out of 20 acorns. Characters. The people in the story. Protagonists, antagonists, good versus evil people. I'm really trying to tap into the way that Ray Bradbury speaks in this book. I actually really like the characters in this book. I find them to be a highlight. I usually find characters to be a highlight. I am someone who likes to read because of characters and like psychology and the relationships of characters. And I would say this book definitely fed my soul in that way. It primarily focuses on two boys who live next door to each other and are about 13, 14 years old. And they're very different, and yet at the same time, because of their proximity to each other, they are best friends. I thought that it really did a good job of painting the picture of what it is like to have friends as a kid, because it's not like you can really pick and choose your friends to a degree. You're really friends with whoever's around you. I find as a kid, you don't really get to have a whole lot of boundaries. You still want to be friends with people. You still want to belong, even if you're different. And I really feel like that bond is represented in these two characters. It took me back a little bit to when I was a kid, and how sometimes you'd have friends where you'd get into a fight and you'd be like, we're not friends anymore. And then the next day you'd be like, I'm sorry, let's be best friends forever. And you're like, okay. And to have that little give and take. The townsfolk in Greentown are perfectly normal and dull, which I kind of loved because that really created a contrast between the carnival folk, who are much more colorful and creative and flashy and interesting. And I feel like the townsfolk really kind of give it a grounded feel. There's interesting character transformations over time, and there's satisfying developments between characters as well. One of the two boys' father is dead, and the other boy's father is still around. And I really love the relationship that they have with this father figure. And it really does kind of feel like partly a story of father-son bonding. And even though I'm not a father, I really did relate a lot with the father figure in this book. He's a relatively isolated hermit. He works at a library, so he's regularly just hiding himself in books. He thinks heavily upon life, and he talks at length. Seriously, this character has like 3 monologues that are like multiple pages each, and frankly and it gets to the point where even his character sees people like tuning out, or people being like, you're talking a bit too much, and I relate with that so much. So I felt really seen by this character. Some characters were really reflective of the times, of course. This is in the 1960s. It's mostly male focused. The women literally do stay at home. I mean, they do come out to the carnival, but as far as like their average daily life, you know, the kids are out running, the women are at home, the men are at work. So it is very representative of that time in the United States. And there is a relatively negative view of like gypsy life, the carny stereotypes. It really just felt more like a time capsule to me than anything reflective of today's issues. So I didn't take much issue with that, but I don't know, I'm also a man, so I don't know how this would feel reading it as a female. But I feel like it made sense in this book. I don't know, it felt more, like I said, it felt more like a time capsule. Not all the carnies are bad by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of them are seen as having suffered in life. And so overall, I really thought that the characters was a smash hit in this book. I give Something Wicked This Way Comes 20 out of 20 acorns for characters. Originality. Uniqueness. What sets it apart from the rest? Have we heard this story before? And does it matter? Arguably, none of my opinions matter, so thank you for watching. When it comes to originality, I really try to look for other stories that I'm reminded of as I read. And the only real comparisons I could come up with were like eerie campfire stories. Like this would be a long, eerie campfire story, but it fits that vibe so well. And the other comparison I could come up with really were those really campy 80s horror films, because there definitely are like campy elements to this, and yet being told from a child's perspective, like everything, even the campy aspects, everything is like really big deal. I found Ray Bradbury's writing style to be fairly unique. He has this way of poetically extrapolating on everything. Almost everything kind of becomes a list or a metaphor or a simile. And while that literary flourish kind of got to be a bother at times, it really did create some unique perspectives. because he applies so much meaning to every moment. His imaginative views of like a simple field, the concept of 3 o'clock in the morning, or even the value of fixating on good versus evil, they just filled the book with interesting ideas, and I really enjoyed sitting with those moments when they came, and it did set the book apart, in my opinion. The carnival attractions and some characters holds a couple of magic systems, like one definitely hard magic system and a few like soft magic systems where you don't entirely understand the limits or how it works, but you get the gist. And I think that it's really effective and interesting. So overall, I feel like this book does have a lot of originality to it, and because of that, I give Something Wicked This Way Comes 20 out of 20 acorns for originality. Readability, accessibility, literary obstacles. Did I ever want to put the book down? Honestly, I would say that this book is not very accessible by today's literary standards. He uses a lot of abstract ideas, outdated words, sometimes even made up words, and it can make some of these literary flourishes seem more confusing than purposeful, especially from a modern lens. There's plenty of clunky run-on sentences that completely lack punctuation. And it dilutes the clarity for me just for the sake of everything being like a literary mechanism. It's crammed full of literary devices like similes, metaphors, analogies up the wazoo, okay? On every page. And like I said before, it really felt like every time I picked up this book, I had to reformat my brain to Ray Bradbury's style of writing in order to really comprehend everything he was putting in front of me. At first, this came across really ostentatious to me, just kind of showy, like as though he wanted every paragraph to be quoted or considered poignant and deep. And I feel like that could really turn a lot of people away. And one thing that I found helpful for myself when it came to this struggle was reading aloud. When I would read aloud and kind of try to make sense of it verbally, it really did help with my comprehension of the word salad that was sometimes in front of me. It is only 314 pages. Having said that, it's still so dense that I needed to put the book down regularly. But I do think it's worth putting in the effort for the story itself. And once I did reformat my mind to the words, I really enjoyed what I was reading. But I think the readability is less accessible than it is accessible. So I gave readability an 8 out of 20 acorns. Narration, how the story was told. Prose, the structure of the story. My experience of the storytelling. So the whole book takes place over a span of a weekend. When a storm's running in, and so is a circus, and then you experience the 2 days the circus is there. That's really the span of the book. So nearly every moment is accounted for. He does do a little bit of time hopping here and there, but he always summarizes like what happens. And sometimes it's like, man, all of this fit into one night, so sometimes, it's dense, it's crammed. But his storytelling is consistently eerie, which is why I likened it to like a campfire story. It feels like he is regularly reminding you that it's a little chilly and it's a little spooky and there's darkness and shadows and what's that over there? It's got this really lovely, consistent eeriness. The scenes were very gripping for me, especially once I did format my brain appropriately, and they're vibrant. Ray Bradbury does really have a skill when it comes to vibrant imagery. He's very imaginative and creative with what he's presenting. Because of how much he does extrapolate in every single scene, it makes the really eventful scenes super memorable, and it also makes the kind of boring scenes super memorable too, because everything is extrapolated on. And I felt like I could almost envision everything when it wasn't overly riddled with archaic phrases and things. But overall, I found the story to be very consistent, and I found it to be very satisfying throughout, including the ending. I was sold at the beginning of this book with his presentation of a salesman coming into town, but ahead of a storm and selling people lightning rods, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then as the story went on, even every time that I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna really want to keep going with this book, it's just so dense, I'm just so tired, I'd be like, and here's another really interesting scene, and here's another really interesting scene. And he did actually keep me wanting to remain invested in the book, even with my reader's fatigue. I could have done with fewer lists. I forgot to mention this book is third person past tense. But overall, by the end of the book, I was sold again on the writing, on the storytelling, and I really ended in a place where overall I feel like the narration was much more successful than it wasn't, even with the obstacles. So I give Something Wicked This Way Comes 17 out of 20 acorns in narration. So overall, for Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes, I give it a total of 80 out of 100 acorns. I feel like this is a successful story. I think that if I was a kid and I had read this book, it would have been one of my favorites. My dad had a bookshelf of a bunch of old books that I would pick off the shelf a lot. I think there were a lot of Hardy Boys in there. And I would just read these books, and they were written very similarly to this. And so it really did bring a lot of nostalgia to me as a kid, which is probably why I did connect with it. I don't know if any younger modern readers today would care to put in the investment to reformat their minds to the writing of this book. But for me, I'm really glad that I read this. So yeah, effective book. I really liked it. 80 out of 100. Now, at the time of recording this, it's October 24th. I have a week left of October, and I think that's good enough for one more book in the spooky genre. So let's spin the wheel. All right, here we go. I've got my horror TBR list wheel up, and we are going to spin. I will say, if I get something that's over 600 pages, I am not going to read it, and I will spin again. I don't want to cram a huge book into the last week of October, so let's hope for something short, please. Let's see. Oh my gosh, what? Okay. How many? I do have the lengths of these written down. Let's see. All right, The Exorcist is 400 pages. I can read 400 pages in a week, right? All right, let's do it. The Exorcist. I'm nervous, but hey, I think it's time to see if I'm going to be able to keep my cool with The Exorcist, or if I'm going to finally have a book this season that scares me. I've still not been scared. Maybe I just can't be scared by books anymore. Who knows? Well, I hope everybody has a wonderful whatever, and until next time, bye. Da-da-down, ba-ba-bum, BookSquirrel. I don't know.